Right, should I do my second one now? So,
Please.
now as you know, I'll have about 23 websites. So as a result, I couldn't just have one newsletter. I need two newsletters, right? So I've got my Tips for Teachers one, which is a kind of short tip that I put out every Monday. And then I do my ED newsletter, which is more kind of long form kind of thoughts and stuff like that on pedagogy based on things that I've seen in schools. So a few weeks ago, I put out one called The Myth of Copying Things Down. And it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, how a lot of the things we ask kids to copy down in class, particularly lesson objectives, worked examples and corrections, are at best a waste of time and at worst really kind of counterproductive to learning, because the reason I think this happens, worked example is a classic one, right? Teacher does this worked example, kids don't have a bloody clue what's going on, but it doesn't matter because they're going to copy it down at the end of it. And it's like the teacher and the kids assume that something magic happens in this copying down that's going to cause them to either understand it now or understand it later. So it doesn't matter if they're not paying attention in the moment because they've got this magic copying down coming up. So anyway, I wrote this big piece why I think copying things down is a bit of a waste of time. Split the crowd, as you can imagine. And when I work in schools, it's particularly SLT, they're obsessed with book scrutinies and having things in books because it's seen as a proxy for learning, it's seen as a proxy for effort and so on and so forth. Anyway, so I want to get your take on this, and to do it, I've got two things I've seen this last week that I thought were quite interesting kind of examples of this. So the first is, I was in a lesson, it's exam time in the UK, so GCSEs are happening really soon and A-levels happening soon. So a lot of exam classes are doing past papers, going through exam papers. So I was watching a lesson where a teacher was going through a past paper, and the kids all had their paper in front of them, and the teacher under the visualizer was essentially going through how she would answer the paper. And there wasn't much kid-student interaction. Every now and again, she'd throw a question out to a child and stuff. But the kid's main role was to compare their answers to the teacher's answers, and with a green pen, and it had to be green, correct. So if their answer was different from the teacher's, they would cross out their answer and write in the corrections. And I was sat next to a girl while she was doing this, and she was correct, like question 2, whatever it was, standard form. She got it wrong. She, corrected it down. And I said to her two things. I said, 1, do you understand that correction? She said, no, I don't have a clue what's going on here. And I said, 2, what's the plan here? What are you going to do with this? Are you going to look at this paper again? No, just going to put it in the file or whatever. Now, that might have just have been that kid, right? But I think this is a kind of wider thing of this notion of corrections, that, again, something magic happens when a child corrects something. And corrections, they're inherently untestable. I always make this point, right? Like, we know the best way for kids to learn and remember things is to retest themselves. And a correction is the worst way to do this because, let's say, for example, I try and teach you something and you've got something wrong, so you correct it. And then you're a really conscientious student. And next week you think, I'm going to retest myself on that. First, you've got to find the thing that you got wrong, which is often trickier. It's buried in an exercise book or a test or whatever. But then how the hell do you retest yourself? You've got to kind of cover up the correction that you've done so you see the original question, or you've got to be really organized to think, I'm going to write out that question whilst not looking at the answer, or leave it, make sure I forget that answer because otherwise it's not a good test. They're very unquizzable corrections just generally. So anyway, I have a problem with corrections, and I thought that was an interesting one. And the point I made to the teacher is, I'm not convinced kids got a great deal out of the hour that the teacher was going through this test. And I think that hour could have been spent a lot better with simply, all right, watch me solve this problem that you've all struggled on. Now here's a related problem, do it on your mini whiteboard, show me. That kind of thing would have felt much more, impactful. But there seems to be this need for written evidence. And if you'd have done the whiteboard stuff, you wouldn't have got the lovely green pen out and blah, blah, blah. So that's one. So I'm interested in your take on that kind of corrections. Are they useful? How do you make them more useful? And the second one, and this is my big thing at the moment, right? So I was in a lesson on probability, and it was a year 7 lesson. Now it's really interesting in the UK, that these days, kids in primary school, they don't do anything on probability. In the primary curriculum, there's nothing at all. So the first time a kid encounters probability, unless they meet it just, in day-to-day life, first time they meet it formally is year 7 at the earliest, or some schemes of work leave it till year 8. So, you might be 13 or 14 before you've met probability. And you know as well as me, probability, it can be quite an abstract concept for kids. Unless it's kind of presented in a way that's really tangible, it can be quite confusing, probability and so on. So I was in this lesson and the teacher had introduced probability. And the introduction was fairly nice. There was cubes bombing around. They weren't physical, but, it was a fairly nice, introduction, whatever. And then the teacher said, right, let's copy down our probability formula. And the probability formula was like, probability of an event is equal to, then there was a fraction, on the top it was like number of times the event we're interested in occurs, and on the denominator of the fraction it was like the total number of outcomes possible. And the kids all wrote this down happily in their book, and then the teacher then went on to do a worked example the kids practiced. I said to a kid, what does that mean? Like, I've no idea. I said, what's an event? What's an outcome? No idea. So it was literally a waste of their time writing this thing down. But my point there is, there's two ways you could take that. One, don't have them write it down, which I'd be in favour of. But if you're going to have them copy examples down, my new insight, and this may be the most obvious thing you've ever heard, but the point most teachers ask kids to copy something down is the worst time to do it, because that's at the time they understand it the least, because it's new to them. So when we ask kids to copy that probability formula down, they don't have a bloody clue what it means. Or when we do a worked example like an I do, we do, you do, get the kids to copy down the I do, they don't understand it. It's the first time they've ever seen this. So if you're going to get them to copy it down, make it at the end of the lesson. Make it at the point where they've got some familiarity, they've got some experience, some confidence with it. So you imagine those kids, they copy down that probability formula at the end of the lesson. They can then are in a position to annotate it or whatever. They understand it because they've got lots of examples behind them. Or the worked example, make the plenary of the lesson. Let's go back to a really simple example, but let's make it meaningful to us. So let's copy it down in our books, but now let's start putting arrows around it. Why did I divide by 5 here? Why? All the kind of self-explanation prompts that Michael Persson talks about, kids can only engage with them whenever it actually makes sense to them. And I don't think when kids are first presented with a worked example, they copy it down to book, it makes any sense at all. So to recap, they're my two things I'd like you to reflect on, all if you want. Corrections, I think, are potentially a bit of a waste of time, a real kind of poor proxy for understanding. And then copying things down, if you're going to do it, don't do it at the point kids are novices, they first encounter it. Let kids build up a bit of experience, and then that copying down has a bit of meaning. And any thoughts on either of those, mate?
Love it, Craig. Well, I'm gonna pull out a resource that I pulled out.
Okay, I don't know what this is. It's exciting.
Well, not last week, but last time. It's this really ugly book that I showed you.
Oh yes, yeah.
Which is the book of kind of every question you're going to be required to do, and here's the solution. I couldn't agree more, Craig. Well, first of all, getting kids to copy things down is magical, and I'll tell you why. It's because they shut up for a while.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's one of the most tempting and lovely things
Very
about
true.
getting kids to copy.
Yep.
In a noisy class,
Yep.
even with a bunch of naughty kids.
Yeah, you're right.
If they also think it's important to copy something down, they're going to be quiet. However, I don't think that quietness is quite worth the learning loss or the time required to copy things down. So the way that I've got around this traditionally, and that we got around it last year, was basically providing students with the set of fully worked examples in a format that they can then use. So in the past, I've done this with just like a little slip of paper, and every lesson, the worked example I'm going to give them, I will have pre-printed out and I'll hand it to them after I have gone through it. But last year we were sufficiently organized that we produced this book, which has all the fully worked questions in it for them. Like, I'm tempted to show you something, but it's a podcast, so people aren't going to be able to see it at all.
Oh, I'll tell you what, though, we've got this on the video, Al. Go and show us one. This will get people to click on the video.
I came across a good one there. I mean, here's a simple example. Like, it's kind of got... Can you see that?
Yeah, I can,
It's got the category at the top. It's got two kind of key definitions in a red box there.
Yep.
Then it's got the question.
Yes.
And it's got, like, what a kid needs to put on their calculator.
Nice. Yeah, got
to
it.
get the answer right. And then, like, working.
Lovely.
This is the type of question you're going to get. Here's the key ideas in red boxes. Here's a question. Here's a work solution. And it's just like, so the students have that. They know they have that. And so they can fully listen when you're actually going through the explanation. Also, it provides that scaffold for the teacher. The slides that I used here was the question without the solution there. And I would work through it step by step. this was last year before I got convinced by slideshows, Craig, which we argued about last time. No, but I would work through it, and then I could say, now you can refer back to that. And if you'd like to make any annotations to the worked example of things that you just saw that were helpful, feel free to make those annotations now. And then we'd get out the mini whiteboards and we do a few similar questions, right? And so I think it's actually absolutely necessary, because otherwise you are wasting a hell of a lot of time. But also students want a record, and they deserve to have a record somewhere. So whether you produce that yourself or whether you just use a textbook that has worked examples in it, I don't think it really matters, as long as the students have the record, but they're not trying to copy it down at the same time. So yeah.
Let me just ask you on that then, Ol. And again, it's a bit of a leading question, this. Are kids capable, once you've gone through it, at making meaningful annotations? Or, again, to go back to my previous argument, would those annotations not be more meaningful after a period of kind of 20 minutes, 25 minutes, practice of engaging with lots of different examples? How do you find kids are they good at personalizing it?
Great question. I think, yeah, so I probably actually misspoke then. Probably what's more valuable is the teacher actually saying, see this step. It's more like a Michael Persson kind of a thing. So it's like, have a look at this particular step, or have a think about a specific step, and get them to really focus in on that, process it, identify what the key thing is there. And then the teacher might say, now the key thing is here is actually blah, blah, blah. I want you to make a note of this at this point and draw an arrow here and label this. And so we actually had some probability ones. And so with the probability type questions, it could be like, what is an event? I'm going to tell you what an event is, and I'm going to circle the event there and draw an arrow to it and say, this is what's meant by an event, right? So that could be an example. Now that's something that could actually already be in the resource, but it's also something that is a note that students can take that hopefully makes sense for them. So that could be a scaffolded process. Then we would usually jump into the similar examples. And then I agree with you, Craig, and thanks for pulling me up on that one. I think they are much better prepared to make meaningful annotations after a bit more time thinking and a bit more time processing, and maybe even throw in a pair, like a bit of a pair share there, and then like a bit of a class discussion about what are some of the annotations people made, or a bit of circulation, identifying some quality annotations, then bring them up under the visualizer, sharing them with the rest of the class. Did you want to come back on that?
Just one thing. So this kind of ties into something else, but I'll bring it back, I promise. So I'm obsessed with lots of things, right? The end of lessons is really interesting. So often what teachers will do, and I've done this myself, the last question in a lesson will be the hardest question that the kids get. It's a challenge question. And that's not necessarily a great idea, because only a few kids get it right. The rest of the kids feel a bit crap. You haven't got that good sense of where kids are at. I think there's potential to kind of tie these two things together, right? So you could, you do your whole lesson as normal, probability or whatever. And then your final kind of task of the lesson is, okay, here's a question back to kind of the core objectives of that lesson. And I want you to do two things. First, I want you to do a full written solution to it. And then I want you to show me how much you really understand this by annotating that solution to make it make sense for somebody who doesn't understand it. And then you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You've got that whole class check of understanding. Kids can do it on whiteboards or whatever. But you've got also that kind of physical record in books, and you've got them trying to self-explain and so to go back to the probability formula example, by the end of the lesson, kids could probably say, all right, I know what an event is, and I'll be able to give you 5 examples of events that we've done in this lesson, we've already seen. Whereas the alternative to that is the teacher says, okay, so an event could be this, or an event could be that, or an event could be this. But it's very abstract then. Whereas if the kids have worked through questions where they've actually had to wrestle with this idea of event, they can do it. So I just think the end of the lesson, there could be potential to do a worked example there, almost as a bit of a plenary, a kind of annotated worked example. And I like the idea of Peter Lillenhall, Building Thinking Classrooms for Mathematics, his idea of when you make notes for your forgetful future self. I think that's a really nice kind of concept to think about who you're kind of writing these notes for. So I just think worked example as a plenary could be maybe a way forward, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Craig. And I also have to admit that I don't think I've ever cracked the end of class.
No, me neither.
Like I've never really managed to do plenaries well. I've never really done them much at all. Usually students are just kind of in the independent work phase by the end. And it's like, all right, we've got 2 minutes left, class. Remember this homework, make sure it's in your book. Now, is that a missed opportunity? Potentially. Maybe. But I think also a few extra minutes for independent practice can also be really valuable as well. So, but I think that would be something that would really worthwhile.
Interesting.
Out and
maybe we'll dive into end of lessons. That could be something we pick up in future months. You have a few thoughts about that. Lovely, Al. Right.
Yeah, that'd be.
What
I didn't address your first part, which was
all about
the corrections and the student making like their green pen corrections, and corrections are fundamentally unquizzable. I came across this pretty good book this week. I was a bit early in this week, but I got my copy this week. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh, yes. Now we're talking. Things are looking up here.
It's called Tips for Teachers by Craig Barton. I'm not sure where I got the title from. It's quite similar to one I've heard from another author that came out slightly before it. But nonetheless, there's a lot of good ideas in it. And in fact, one of the sections, it was funny because I was looking through this the other day, and I saw a section that harked back to our original interview back in something like 2017.
Yeah. Oh, it's been a game changer for me, that one, It really was.
Yeah. And so, there was a strategy that I used to use more than I use now, which I think is actually really powerful in this, and it's creating kind of revision cards for yourselves. So, as you know, Craig, as I'm explaining to you, it's in your book, but for the benefit of listeners, the idea is that rather than students making corrections on their test or something like that, they will have a A4 sheet of paper, and on the front of it, they copy out the question and the question alone. That's all that's on the front. And then on the back, they copy out the fully worked solution. And then this goes into a folder, and it's basically a large-scale flashcard that they can then use in their revision. So I think, this ticks the boxes of there's the record. So, if your senior leadership wants records of the corrections that students have made, you've got a clear record of the correction that they've made. Plus they've had to do the processing, hopefully themselves, or got it from somewhere to kind of get the solution. Plus, it's actually quizzable, and it's a useful study resource for them in future.
I absolutely, again, I think this might have been, I don't know if it's your peak because you've kind of got better, but this is one of the best things you've ever said to me was this. I absolutely love this. I've shared this with loads of schools. My only kind of refinement I've made is on the front of cards now, I have the question, and I also have a reference where the kids can go to either access more examples of this or kind of a video or something like that. So in the UK, lots of people will subscribe to things like Sparks or MyMaths, kind of online learning platforms. So it's quite nice if you have a reference where they can go there if they want to get further help or further practice. So that on the front of the card, that works quite well there. And on the back of the card, as well as the correct solution, I also like them to describe the mistake they made, because that just gets them better at, kind of reflecting on their own learning. It's quite good when they kind of see the progress they've made, gets them better at communication and so on. But yeah, I'm a huge fan. And I think that's if I'm going through a test, either review cards or watch me do this, and I'm going to ask you a similar problem you're going to show me on whiteboards, for me destroys, in terms of the effect on learning, the flipping, get the green pen out, copy things down, and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, no, just got that
totally. I did see that you suggested adding that resource on the front of the cards. I would like to push back against that.
I knew this would be coming.
I think
it's good. Go on.
I think it's valuable to link to a resource, but I think that should be on the back of the card, because you don't want this kind of harks back to your point about hints last lesson and checks last assessment and checks for understanding. You don't want anything, in the words of Doug Rohr, before a student solves a problem, the first thing they need to do is work out which solution method to pursue, and you don't want any hints on the front of that card that they're going to tell them that it's a Pythagoras question or a SOHCAHTOA question, other than the actual question.
Good point.
Of
yeah, good point. I'll take that all. Yeah, you're on. But I'd love to have a counter argument there, but I don't. Bottom line is you're right. We'll go with that. That's good. Love it.